The air in the Whisper Creek Estates clubhouse was thicker than the stagnant water in the old reservoir. It tasted of expensive wood polish, stale coffee, and the suffocating certainty of institutional power. Elias Vance sat at the head of the long mahogany table, not as an invited guest, but as an unavoidable nuisance. His tailored suit felt like borrowed skin, a concession to the theater of this final hearing. But his hands, calloused from decades of working the land, gripping the armrests, felt entirely his own. Across from him, 3 members of the Homeowners Association Board, the triumvirate of Trim, sat in judgment. Marcus Thorne, the HOA president, was the centerpiece, a man whose wealth had been acquired via abstract financial maneuvers and whose confidence was inversely proportional to his real-world experience. He wore a smile as smooth and impenetrable as the granite countertop beside him. Beside Thorne sat Helen Carver, the treasurer, sharp-edged and obsessed with line items, and finally David Chen, the secretary, whose perpetually nervous posture suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Vance, let's be efficient," Thorne began, his voice a practiced, velvet drone that barely concealed his impatience. "We've been over the details for 6 months. The dam, or rather the earthen structure, as our legal counsel insists on calling it, is non-compliant." Elias leaned forward, his 70 years giving his voice a gravitas that Thorne's 30-something arrogance could never match. "It's called the Vance Dam, Mr. Thorne. It's been here since 1998, and if we're talking efficiency, let's talk function. My structure is the only thing protecting the lower ridge, which includes your newly installed infinity pool, from the seasonal runoff of the Whisper Creek tributary. The dam functions. It holds." Helen Carver didn't look up from her tablet. "It holds, yes, but at a tremendous and entirely unauthorized cost to the community. You stopped paying the designated flood control and maintenance fee 7 years ago, Mr. Vance. That fee is $350 per quarter. The accumulated debt, with penalties, now stands at $32,000. She tapped the screen, the sound echoing in the silence. "The board cannot, in good conscience, subsidize a private structure, regardless of its claimed function, that is generating an accruing deficit." "A deficit?" Elias let out a dry, incredulous chuckle. "I designed and built that dam myself with my own hands after the '97 deluge wiped out half of the original creek bed. I use my own funds, my own equipment. You call it a private structure. I call it the insurance policy you all inherited when you bought into this development. And the fee you cite, it was instituted after the dam was built, purely to cover the aesthetic landscaping around the top of the reservoir. Aesthetics. I wouldn't pay $32,000 to trim the weeds on a structure that protects $400 million worth of real estate." Thorne waved a dismissive hand, cutting Elias off mid-sentence. "That's irrelevant, Mr. Vance. The bylaws are clear. When you signed the covenant, you agreed to the governance of the association. The structure falls within the boundary of common land and impacts the community aesthetic. Our legal team, led by Mr. Peterson, has determined that, due to the material breach of payment, we are fully within our rights, per Section 4, Paragraph B, to mandate its removal and remediation at the owner's expense." Elias reached into his briefcase and slammed a sheaf of documents onto the table. They were stamped with the logo of the Regional Meteorological Office and the seal of a well-respected hydrologist. "Then let's talk about something relevant." "The weather," Elias said, his voice dropping, forcing the board members to pay attention. "I just received this update. We have an abnormal atmospheric river stalling off the coast. The forecast models are calling for a 90% chance of 3 to 5 inches of rain in the next 48 hours, hitting the higher elevations directly. That is a Level 3 flood alert for this watershed. The ground is already saturated from the spring thaw." He pushed a topographical map across the table. "Look at this. The dam is designed for a 20-year flood event. It's holding back a significant volume right now. If you breach that wall, if you touch a single shovel to the spillway, the surge will flood the low-lying areas. It will inundate Willow Bend, where Mr. Chen lives, and it will turn the entire foundation of the new community center into a bog." David Chen finally looked up, his eyes wide. "Marcus, is that accurate?" Thorne didn't even glance at the maps. He gave a patronizing sigh, leaning back in his expensive leather chair. Mr. Vance, this is the classic tactic of the desperate, fear-mongering. You're retired, you're emotional, and you're trying to use sensational weather reports to avoid a legitimate financial consequence. We have our own engineers. They said the removal is safe, provided we use controlled drainage. Controlled drainage takes 3 weeks, Elias roared, losing the battle for his composure. You don't have 3 weeks. This storm is moving fast. You breach it now and you're not controlling the water. You're unleashing it. You are signing an eviction notice for the water, and that water is going to claim collateral. Helen Carver put down her tablet, her gaze cold and steady. Mr. Vance, the contractor is scheduled for tomorrow at 6 a.m. We are moving forward with remediation. You can either sign this waiver acknowledging the debt and authorizing the removal, or we will place a lien on your property that will dwarf the cost of the unpaid fees. The finality in her voice was a physical weight. Elias stared at the three faces, the arrogance of Thorne, the rigid legalism of Carver, and the terrified neutrality of Chen. They didn't see a structure that saved them. They saw a ledger entry. They saw an aging man who defied their authority. "You've made a catastrophic mistake," Elias whispered, but the quiet intensity of his voice carried more threat than any shout. He didn't sign the waiver. He simply stood up, pushed his chair in precisely, and walked out, leaving the topographical map and the weather reports lying like discarded prophecies on the polished wood. Elias spent the rest of the day in a frantic, losing race against the clock. He called the county water authority, but they deferred to the HOA's private property rights. He called local news outlets, but his story, "Old Man Argues with HOA," didn't hold up against the backdrop of an impending but still distant storm. He was a Cassandra in a subdivision built on denial. The next morning, at 5:58 a.m., he stood on his porch, the pre-dawn sky a bruised slate gray, already weeping a light, steady drizzle. The air was thick and heavy, the kind of air that precedes a violent atmospheric reckoning. He didn't need a weather satellite to know the creek was higher. He could hear it from his house, a deeper, more urgent hush from the direction of the dam. At 6:05 a.m., the ground began to vibrate. A procession of heavy machinery rounded the bend, a massive excavator, 2 bulldozers, and a flatbed carrying demolition tools. They were accompanied by 3 shiny black SUVs. Out of the lead SUV stepped Marcus Thorne, dressed in a pristine white rain jacket that looked utterly ridiculous. With him were 2 security guards, professional, anonymous men in dark tactical gear, and a man in a hard hat who was clearly the site foreman. Elias walked down his driveway, deliberately slow, crossing the damp asphalt until he stood at the edge of the common land, 50 feet from the dam's earthen abutment. Thorne approached, managing to look impeccably dry and smug despite the rain. "A dramatic exit yesterday, Mr. Vance. I appreciate the punctuality today. We have a schedule to keep." "You're going to breach it in the rain, Thorne?" Elias asked, his voice low and steady. "Look at the sky. Listen to the water. That creek is talking, and it's telling you to back away." "I'm listening to my legal team and my engineering consultants," Thorne countered, gesturing to the man in the hard hat. "Mr. Delano here is going to use precision charges on the lowest tier of the central spillway. Controlled flow. We anticipate a slow drain over 48 hours, well within the safety parameters for the current forecast." "The current forecast is irrelevant," Elias snapped, pointing a trembling finger toward the east. "It's about the incoming forecast. Look at the radar, man!" "That's not a forecast. It's a hurricane-level rain event without the wind. If you blast that wall, you are creating a cannon for the water when the surge hits. The board has been briefed on all contingencies." "Elias," Thorne said, using Elias's first name with a sneer of false intimacy. He took a step back, folding his arms. "You have made your protest. Now, please, step back to your property line. The contractor is authorized to begin work, and my security detail is authorized to ensure no interference." Elias didn't move. He stood there, defiant, absorbing the rain and the hopelessness of the moment. He looked past Thorne to the towering yellow excavator, its massive arm already rotating into position over the dam's lip. "You believe you are powerful." "Thorne," Elias said, his voice carrying clearly over the rumble of the idling engine. "You believe your fees and your bylaws trump the laws of physics. That water is a creature of consequence, and it does not recognize your property lines or your annual dues. When it comes, it won't be looking for a receipt. It will be looking for balance." Thorne just smiled, that same arrogant, unyielding smile. "A bit dramatic, Elias, but noted. Mr. Delano, commence." The foreman nodded curtly. The massive engine of the excavator roared to life, and the heavy tracks began to churn the mud near the bank. Elias watched, a co. For a single agonizing second, Marcus Thorne was frozen. The bright screen of his phone, displaying the stark, red-bordered text of the extreme flash flood warning, was a violent intrusion on the smug reality he had constructed. It felt like a physical punch, confirming the absurdity that his $32,000 fee dispute had triggered an impending disaster. He looked from the phone to Elias Vance, the older man's face a mask of bitter, sorrowful resignation, and then to the dam breach. The 6-foot gap carved by the excavator was no longer a precise, controlled spillway. The upstream pressure, suddenly unleashed, had already ripped at the soft earth around the concrete, widening the tear to nearly 8 feet. The water, a frothing, coffee-colored torrent, wasn't draining. It was exploding out of the reservoir with the sound of a jet engine. "Delano! Stop! Stop the machine!" Thorne finally shrieked, his voice thin and high-pitched, completely foreign to his usual measured tone. The foreman, Mr. Delano, was already scrambling. He'd seen the color of that water before, not the gentle runoff of a typical storm, but the pressurized, sediment-heavy, furious output of an overfull basin. He pulled the excavator's arm back so violently the heavy machinery rocked on its treads. "We can't stop it, sir!" Delano shouted back, jumping down from the cab, his hard hat already sliding off his wet head. "The soil is too saturated. It's tearing the foundation. That thing's going to collapse the entire bank." The security guards, previously standing rigid, now looked around nervously, pulling their collars up against the accelerating rain. The heavy machinery, meant for demolition, was now a liability, a useless yellow obstacle in the path of a rapidly forming river. "My house is on Willow Bend," one of the guards muttered. Pulling out his own phone, Elias Vance hadn't moved. He simply watched the torrent, his expression shifting from anger to a chilling, detached calculation. He saw the physics of the disaster unfolding with cold clarity. "It's too late for the breach, Thorne," Elias said, his voice quiet but slicing through the noise. "The integrity of the main earthwork is compromised. When the major surge hits the tributary in the next 10 minutes, this will not be a creek. It will be a tidal wave through your lower development." Thorne rushed forward, slipping on the slick mud, his pristine white jacket now spattered with brown grime. His financial world was crashing into the physical world, and the physical world didn't care about his credit rating. "What do we do, Vance?" "You built it! You know this land!" "What do we do to slow it down?" Thorne pleaded, the arrogance entirely evaporated, replaced by frantic desperation. Elias looked at him, the rain washing the mud off Thorne's cheek, but not the terror. "You fired your insurance policy 30 minutes ago, Thorne. There is no we. There is only the consequence of your balance sheet." "David Chen! He lives right there!" Thorne yelled, pointing vaguely toward the cluster of new expensive townhomes nestled closest to the creek's flood zone. "You said Willow Bend." "We have people there. We have families." "You had my reports, Thorne. You saw the topographical map. You chose $32,000 over the safety of those families," Elias countered, not moving an inch. He wasn't arguing anymore. He was delivering final judgment. Delano, the foreman, was already shouting into his radio. "Evacuate Willow Bend. Code red. Immediate vertical evacuation. Get everyone out of the first floor!" The roar of the creek was now continuous, a primal sound of massive energy transfer. The remaining concrete of the spillway gave a deep structural crack, and the breach widened again, now a 12-foot chasm. The surge was coming, a quarter-mile away, in a sleek, minimalist townhome on Whisper Creek's lowest loop. David Chen was staring at his own phone with paralyzed horror. He had dismissed Elias's theatrics as emotional exaggeration, but the local news alert flashing across his screen was identical to the one Thorne had just received. He glanced out the window. The trickle of water that usually decorated his back garden, his property abutted the creek bed, was gone. In its place was a churning brown tide, already creeping up the first step of his polished stone patio. Chen's wife, Sarah, rushed in, holding their 7-year-old daughter, Lily. "David, the HOA just sent a text. It says Level 3 evacuate. What does that even mean?" Chen, normally decisive in his role as a corporate lawyer, was useless. He felt the cold dread that Elias had tried to warn them about. "It means the dam broke, Sarah. We have to get out now." "Get to the car. Don't worry about anything but the essentials." But the problem was already structural. The low-lying road that serviced Willow Bend, the only paved exit, was already submerged in 6 inches of rapidly moving water. They were trapped. Chen ran to the garage. The water was now lapping at the seal, a dark promise of intrusion. He couldn't risk driving the sedan through it. The depth was increasing too fast. He looked at the neighbor's house, a high-standing structure built on pilings. "Sarah! Lily, get to the 2nd floor! Now, we're going to the Andersons' attic! We can't wait for rescue!" The power flickered and died. Silence descended, broken only by the terrifying, sucking sound of the rising water outside. Back at the ruined dam, the chaos was accelerating into full panic. The breach was now fully 20 feet wide. The sheer volume of water escaping the reservoir had transformed the surrounding land into a temporary, violent delta. Thorne, soaked to the bone and shivering, grabbed Elias by the arm. "The community center, it's right next to Willow Bend. If the foundation goes, that whole wing collapses. We have to divert it. There has to be a culvert, a secondary channel you built." Elias violently shook off Thorne's hand. "I built a spillway, you tore it down." "There is no secondary channel. The water is following the path of least resistance, and that is right through Willow Bend, exactly as I showed you on the map." Delano, who had managed to get a better vantage point, yelled, "Mr. Thorne, we have eyes on the creek. The main surge is cresting the upper bank." "It's coming!" "We have about 2 minutes before it hits the breach." Thorne's eyes darted frantically, searching for any solution his abstract mind could grasp. He looked at the heavy machinery, now uselessly parked. His gaze landed on the largest bulldozer. "The bulldozer! We can push the earth!" "Delano, turn that thing around. Start shoving the remaining dirt berm against the breach. Use the other side of the abutment. Maybe we can force the flow back into the main channel." Thorne barked, his old commanding tone fighting through his terror. Delano hesitated. "Sir, that's insane." "The ground is too soft. That machine weighs 12 tons. It'll slide right into the creek bed and I'll drown." "I'm the HOA president." "That's an order. Do it! If you don't, this whole subdivision is ruined." Elias stepped between them. "He's right, Delano. It's a death sentence. The ground underneath the abutment is liquefied. The moment you apply force, you'll lose traction and the water will take you. You're paid to run the machine, not commit suicide for his negligence." Thorne whirled on Elias. "Why are you doing this? You're just standing there watching. You want to see us flood, don't you? You want your revenge!" Elias met his gaze, the rain running down his aged face like tears. "Revenge is a simple thing, Thorne. The irony is better. I built this dam. I know its flaws and I know its strength. The only thing that could have stopped this was keeping it intact. Now, there is one slim chance to save Willow Bend, but it involves the dam's deepest forgotten function." He pointed, not toward the breach, but upstream, toward his own property line, where a small, overgrown grove of ancient oaks marked the end of his land and the beginning of the HOA common property. "I built a diversion wall 40 yards upstream, hidden behind those trees. It's a stone and wire structure, mostly silted over. But it was designed to redirect a 20-year flood event away from the housing tract and into the old, abandoned quarry pit on my land." Thorne's face lit up with desperate hope. "Then open it. Open the diversion, now." Elias smiled, a cold, empty expression that chilled Thorne more than the rising water. "It's a manual sluice gate. It was meant to be maintained by the community, but since the community chose to prioritize $350 in aesthetic fees over actual flood control, that sluice gate is rusted solid. It'll take a full-sized winch and a lot of leverage to even crack it open. And..." Elias paused, letting the crushing weight of his words settle. The only person who has the knowledge of the mechanism, the necessary tools, and the physical strength to operate it is me, and I'm standing on my property, which is safe, watching the storm you chose to unleash. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble again, a deeper, more resonant shudder this time. The surge was arriving. A massive churning wave, almost 4 feet high, crested the embankment where the dam used to stand, and a terrifying whoosh of air displacement preceded a colossal plume of water and debris shooting through the breach. The roar was deafening, primal. Thorne stumbled backward. The water had reached the SUVs, turning the common road into a rapidly moving river. Their escape route was gone. He was trapped on the high bank with Delano, the 2 security guards, and Elias Vance, who held the only key to their salvation. "Vance, I will pay you. 32,000 tripled! I'll sign whatever contract you want. Just open the gate. We have minutes!" Thorne screamed, the sound barely audible over the fury of the water. Elias walked slowly to the edge of his property line, turning his back on the rising flood and the frantic HOA president, UD. The world narrowed to the sound of the water. It was a raw, geological sound, the grinding friction of earth against stone, the monstrous sigh of millions of gallons of liquid fury. When the main surge hit the 20-foot chasm of the ruined dam, the air was instantly filled with a blinding mist of spray and sediment. The 2 SUVs of the demolition team, now fully submerged up to their roofs, were lifted and slammed into each other like toys before being violently swept down the newly formed riverbed. Their tires were the last things visible before the current swallowed them whole. Marcus Thorne staggered back from the edge of the collapsing bank, the white fabric of his jacket clinging to him like a shroud. He was no longer the immaculate, calculating president. He was just a man facing a force that couldn't be quantified on a spreadsheet. Delano, the foreman, grabbed him just as a large chunk of the asphalt road sheared away and dropped into the roaring torrent. "We have to move, Mr. Thorne." "Now!" Delano yelled, pulling him toward the relative safety of Elias Vance's property line. Thorne stumbled past the security guards, who were already uselessly calling for rescue services that couldn't possibly reach them. He saw Elias standing 40 feet away, across the damp grass of his perfectly maintained private lawn. Elias had paused his retreat, his head tilted as if listening to the judgment of the storm. Thorne ran, slipping once and catching himself on a cedar railing, until he crossed the invisible line separating the HOA's disastrous common property from Elias's private domain. He fell to his knees in the grass, not out of fatigue, but out of sheer, overwhelming despair and physical surrender. "Elias, please!" Thorne's voice was hoarse, shredded by the sound of the flood. Water streamed off his carefully styled hair. "I was wrong. I was wrong about the dam. Wrong about the fees. Wrong about everything. It's not about the money now. It's about David Chen. It's about the families in Willow Bend." Elias finally turned, his gaze heavy and unrelenting. He didn't offer a hand to help Thorne up. $32,000, Thorne, Elias stated, his voice calm amidst the chaos. "That's what you prioritized. That's what you risked every home in that valley for. You chose the ledger over the living, I know." "I understand. You win!" Thorne cried, muddying the pristine lawn. "I'll transfer the money now. I'll give you the entire HOA reserve fund. Just tell me how to open that gate." Elias shook his head slowly. "You still don't get it. You think the solution is another transaction. You believe every consequence is fixable with a bigger check. That gate isn't on the HOA's land. It's on my land, and its function was paid for in my time, my sweat, and my understanding of this land. You can't buy that back, Thorne." The intensity of the moment was unbearable. The water, a primal beast unleashed, roared its impatience. "Then what do you want?" Thorne screamed, tears mixing with the rain. "What is the price? Tell me. My house. My career. I'll resign the board. Just tell me what debt I have to pay to get you to move." Elias stared down at him. The man he saw wasn't a powerful HOA president, but a terrified, entitled child. "I want you to admit it," Elias said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing Thorne to strain to hear over the torrent. "I want you to look me in the eye and say that every rule, every fee, every ounce of your self-important authority meant less than the life of one neighbor you don't even know. Say you were blind, arrogant, and negligent. Say you chose pride over people. Thorne swallowed hard, the bitterness of the admission catching in his throat. He looked at the chaos erupting behind him, the brown river that used to be a manicured creek, and the mental image of David Chen's 7-year-old daughter flashed in his mind. I was blind, Thorne confessed, the words scraping out like rust. I was arrogant. I was negligent. I chose the fee and my pride over the lives of my neighbors. You were right, Elias. You were right all along. Elias held the gaze for another second, testing the sincerity, then nodded sharply. Get up. You may be worthless at governance, but you'll be a good mule. We have about 3 minutes before the flood crest hits the sluice. Delano, you're with us! We need leverage! The diversion gate was exactly where Elias said it was, hidden by a thicket of overgrown oak and blackberry brambles 40 yards upstream from the main dam site. It was a formidable, rough-hewn structure, a series of immense, heavy logs backed by wire mesh, all bolted into an ancient stone wall. The iron wheel and crank mechanism, meant to lift the heavy wooden sluice, was fused with rust and wrapped in decades of thick, thorny vines. We need the winch from one of the bulldozers, Delano shouted, his professional training kicking in despite the terror. No time! Elias retorted, already yanking violently at the thickest vines. The water's too fast. We open this manually, or we don't open it at all. The handle of the crank is fused. We need to break the rust seal and get a pipe on that wheel for leverage. Elias scrambled toward the storage shed attached to his main house. He returned instantly, carrying a heavy 4-foot-long galvanized pipe and a large can of industrial penetrating oil. Delano, the oil, Elias commanded. Soak that crank connection. Thorne, get the vines off the top of the wheel. We need to see the mechanism. Thorne, moving without question for the first time in his life, attacked the thorny vines with furious energy, tearing them away with his bare hands, the thorns slicing his soft skin. The fear of the flood was a stronger stimulant than any executive bonus. Delano drenched the crank connection with the oil, the acrid smell mingling with the ozone and the damp earth. It's 16 inches of solid iron, Elias. It hasn't moved in 20 years. Elias didn't argue. He shoved the galvanized pipe over one of the spokes of the rusted crank wheel. The pipe was just long enough to act as a powerful lever. Thorne, grab the end of this pipe with me. Delano, brace the wheelbase. We need to turn it a quarter rotation to crack the gate's seal, and then the water pressure should help us the rest of the way, Elias instructed, his years of experience lending authority to every word. The roar from the creek was now a constant, threatening presence. Through the trees, they could see the water level rapidly climbing the stone wall of the sluice, testing the pressure of the unyielding gate. Thorne grabbed the pipe opposite Elias, his hands slick with mud, oil, and blood from the vines. On 3, Elias grunted, planting his feet in the soft earth. 1, 2, 3, they pushed. All the force they could muster, the combined weight and desperation of 2 men, one hardened by work, one softened by luxury, strained against 2 decades of neglect and rust. The pipe groaned. The crank wheel gave a minuscule, agonizing squeak of protest. Elias pushed harder, his neck veins bulging. Thorne, driven by the image of his neighbors drowning, roared with the effort, his expensive suit tearing at the shoulder seam. C-R-A-A-A-N-K. The rust seal broke with a sound like a gunshot. The pipe lurched forward 3 inches, and a thin, dark stream of water immediately began to spurt from the bottom seam of the sluice gate, marking the crack of the seal. But the mechanism had stalled again. The heavy wooden door, swollen with rainwater, was resisting. Again! Everything you have, Thorne! Elias yelled, his lungs burning. Just then, a terrifying sound erupted from the direction of Willow Bend, the sharp, unmistakable crash of a structure giving way. In David Chen's upstairs living room, Sarah was holding Lily tight. David was peering out the window. The community center, the HOA's symbol of lavish community spending, stood about 100 yards away. They watched in horror as the surging flood, now waist-high on the street and moving with impossible speed, undermined the new foundation. The entire corner of the building, where the state-of-the-art gym was housed, groaned, tilted, and then, with a deafening, splintering sound, collapsed into the raging brown water. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, burying her face in Lily's hair. The wave created by the collapse rippled down Willow Bend, instantly surging the water level up to the windowsills of the first floor of their townhouse. They heard the hideous sound of rushing water filling their lower level, carrying furniture and debris. They were trapped, watching their life disappear below them. "David, we need to go higher!" "The attic!" Sarah pleaded, grabbing his arm. Back at the sluice gate, the sight of the community center's collapse provided the final desperate surge of adrenaline. They knew what that crash meant. The water was no longer merely rising. It was destroying. "Now, Thorne, push like you're saving your own life," Elias screamed. Thorne didn't need to be told. He was breathing in ragged gasps, his muscles screaming, but he pushed, driven by a raw, primal need to reverse his catastrophic mistake. Crunch! Grrrrind. The crank wheel finally turned to full rotation. The heavy sluice gate lifted barely 6 inches, but it was enough. The pressure of the water inside the reservoir, sensing a new lower path, exploded into the diversion channel. A secondary, powerful river instantly erupted from the stone structure, rushing directly away from the doomed neighborhood. It shot down a steep, hidden embankment, through the thicket, and plunged into the massive, decades-old quarry pit on Elias Vance's private acreage. The sound of the new flow was immense, a deafening counterpoint to the rush through the dam breach. Elias, gasping, stumbled back from the crank. Delano sagged against the oak tree, vomiting from the physical strain and terror. Thorne stood over the mechanism, covered in mud and sweat, watching the water. The high-pitched whump, whump, whump of the first Coast Guard helicopter arrived 20 minutes later, slicing through the constant downpour. It was a sound of salvation, but also a siren call to accountability. Rescuers were rappelling down ropes into Willow Bend, pulling residents from waterlogged upper stories. The flood was under control, diverted into Elias Vance's quarry pit. But the destruction was vast and muddy. Elias, Thorne, and Delano were whisked away from the treacherous bank to a temporary triage center set up in the high-elevation tennis courts. Elias was given a silver thermal blanket, though his internal heat came from a well of grim satisfaction. Thorne, shivering violently, his expensive clothing unrecognizable beneath a carapace of oil and earth, was unrecognizable. He was led away by paramedics to be treated for mild hypothermia and shock. Later that evening, after the adrenaline had faded and the rain had settled into a sullen drizzle, the surviving board members and the most heavily impacted residents gathered in the only functional, dry common area, the high-ceilinged, glass-walled conference room of the old country club, a building too high up to be touched by the creek's wrath. The atmosphere was not one of relief, but of vengeful fury. Helen Carver, the treasurer, was there, trying to organize the chaos with the rigid, useless authority of a commander who had just lost the war. She was arguing desperately with a man named Robert, a prominent tax attorney whose home on the Low Ridge had suffered catastrophic foundation damage. "And I am telling you, Robert, we must maintain composure." Helen's voice was strained, high-pitched. "The HOA still exists. We have the remaining 3 board members. We must secure emergency funding and coordinate with insurance adjusters." Robert slammed his fist down on the polished table, making the few cups of cold coffee jump. "Insurance adjusters, Helen? What documentation do you have? Where are the minutes from the meeting where you voted to demolish the dam? Where is the engineering report that approved the breach during a storm warning?" Helen wrung her hands. "The records. They were in the server room, in the clubhouse basement." It was the first thing to go. The water reached the ceiling. "The hard drives, the paper archives, everything, Robert. We have no official history, no ledgers, no proof of policy, and no list of assets except what's in the bank, which, by the way, is currently being frozen by the state due to a major liability crisis." A collective furious moan rose from the gathered residents. Without the records, proving who was responsible, what was covered, or even what fees were due, became a legal nightmare. The entire legal foundation of Whisper Creek Estates had literally been washed away. The door opened, and David Chen walked in, followed closely by his wife, Sarah. They were clean, but their exhaustion was physical. They looked like refugees. Chen was no longer the nervous secretary. He was a victim who had nearly lost everything, and his gaze was hard, focused, and legally lethal. "Where is Thorne?" Chen demanded, his voice low and cutting. Helen stammered, "He's resting." "The paramedics—" "I don't care if he's resting," Chen interrupted, stepping into the center of the room. He signed the order. He was the one who personally mocked Mr. Vance for warning us. "I need to know why the board chose to pay a demolition crew on a day they were explicitly warned would result in a flood." A resident from the Middle Ridge pointed across the room. "Ask the man who did warn us. He's standing right there." All eyes swung to Elias Vance. He stood against the back wall, observing the implosion of the authority he had fought for years. He hadn't said a word since his arrival. Chen walked directly toward Elias, but his expression was complicated. It was a mixture of profound gratitude and a lawyer's calculating scrutiny. "Mr. Vance," Chen said, extending his hand. "David Chen, you saved my family. You saved Willow Bend. We owe you our lives. That gate." It was an act of profound, selfless heroism. Elias shook his hand, the grip brief and firm. "It was an act of neighborliness, Mr. Chen, something the HOA had forgotten the meaning of." "And that's what I need to talk to you about," Chen continued, dropping the volume of his voice. "I am launching the first lawsuit, a class action negligence claim, against the board, against Marcus Thorne, against the demolition company, but primarily against the entity that authorized the act, the HOA. He paused, letting the severity of his intentions sink in. With all the records destroyed, this suit becomes difficult. It's hard to prove premeditation, hard to prove the specific vote, hard to prove who knew what. But you, Elias, you are the key witness. You presented them with the weather report, the maps, the warnings. You are the definitive evidence of their criminal negligence." Elias nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I have copies of everything. The topographical maps, the meteorological reports, my formal written objection, all notarized and safe in a fireproof safe, nowhere near that drowned clubhouse." A collective gasp went around the room. Elias Vance had not just built a physical dam, he had built a dam of documented proof against the very body that sought to find him. "That's invaluable, Elias," Chen said, excitement threading through his voice. "That makes our case a slam dunk. We will crush the HOA, we will collect the insurance payouts, and we will rebuild this community properly." "Rebuild on what foundation, Mr. Chen?" a voice interjected. Marcus Thorne stood in the doorway. He had changed into a dry, albeit ill-fitting tracksuit given to him by a sympathetic paramedic. He looked pale, hollowed out, but something in his eyes had solidified, not into arrogance, but into desperate survival. He walked slowly toward the center, ignoring Helen Carver's frantic whispers. "You're talking about suing the HOA, David," Thorne said, addressing the room. "But the HOA is all of us. When you sue the association, you are suing yourselves. The insurance policies are tied to the association's solvency and governance, which, as Helen just explained, is now in legal limbo. We are facing hundreds of millions in damage, and the moment a class action is filed, the insurers will invoke a governance failure clause. They will fight you for a decade in court, and you will drain every penny of your own savings." He looked around the room, his eyes dark. "The only way this community gets rebuilt quickly is if we stabilize the HOA, secure the insurance payout, and keep the blame contained to a small insurable error." Chen scoffed. "You want us to protect you?" "I want us to protect us," Thorne countered, pointing at Elias. "Because the truth, the one Elias is holding, is a nuclear option. If we present his documents and prove the board's willful, documented negligence, the insurance company walks. You get nothing. You may win the lawsuit, but you will own a pile of worthless land and a half-destroyed dam." Thorne turned to Elias, his voice dropping to a plea. "Elias, I confessed my negligence to you. I did the work. I saved Chen's family. Now I'm asking you to choose. Do you want justice, where I lose everything? But so does everyone else. Or do you want restitution where we, as a community, work together to fabricate a clean story, secure the funds and rebuild? You can be the hero who saved the dam, or the martyr who sank the neighborhood." Elias walked slowly away from the wall, approaching the table. He looked past Thorne, past Chen, toward the large window, where the last drops of the storm hit the glass. There is another option. Thorne, Elias stated, his voice quiet, drawing the entire room into his orbit. You are right. Your willful negligence is a poisoned key. It may unlock justice, but it locks away the funds needed for recovery. And I am not interested in being a martyr, nor do I want to see this land destroyed, even if the people who own it are fools. He placed a heavy, sealed manila envelope on the table, a secondary, unlabeled copy of his documents. The truth is not negotiable, Elias said, looking directly at Thorne. But the management is. You resigned your position to me yesterday. I accept. The board is effectively dissolved. Helen, David, you are both compromised by conflict of interest and negligence. I will not release these documents to Mr. Chen unless I am given one condition. He tapped the envelope. I will not destroy this evidence. I will hold it. But I will use the threat of this evidence to force the insurance company's hand into settlement. Claiming an act of God coupled with an unforeseen structural failure, which is the only way to get money fast. Elias met Thorne's gaze. My condition is simple. Effective immediately, I assume the role of interim president and sole decision-maker for the Whisper Creek Estates Association, without pay until the neighborhood is structurally and financially rebuilt. Every single board member, Thorne, Carver, Chen, will resign tonight. You will all sign documents giving me temporary absolute control. You want restitution? That is the price. The community must be run by someone who understands consequence, not fees. Thorne stared at the envelope, realizing the trap. Elias was not seeking revenge. He was demanding total unilateral power to fix the mess they had made. It was the ultimate ironic turning point. The man the HOA tried to bankrupt and silence had just taken control of the entire HOA, holding their ruin hostage to their rescue. Thorne swallowed hard. He had lost everything except the roof over his head, and he knew Elias was the only way to keep that roof. 6 months passed, and the brutal spring sun beat down on the mud-caked ruins of Whisper Creek Estates. The community had become a construction zone, defined not by the manicured perfection of its past, but by the raw, functional chaos of recovery. There were no more frivolous plantings, no freshly power-washed driveways, and certainly no petty fee notifications. There was only work. Under the absolute control of Elias Vance, the HOA had been transformed from a luxurious governing body into a single-purpose, repair and remediation effort. He had successfully leveraged the threat of his documented evidence, the drowned ledger, to force a massive insurance settlement. But the payout came with draconian conditions: zero tolerance for cosmetic spending, and a requirement for communal labor to minimize external contracting costs. The luxury development was now run like a functioning kibbutz. On a warm Saturday morning, the air was thick with the smells of drying earth and fresh lumber. Marcus Thorne, clad in faded denim and heavy work boots, was shoveling gravel into a mixer at the site of the rebuilt community center foundation. His hands, once soft and tailored for golf grips and signing checks, were now calloused and permanently stained. He worked alongside Robert, the tax attorney, and David Chen, the class action lawyer, who was currently wrestling a heavy 2x4 into place. All of them, stripped of their titles and their old power, were simply homeowners, subjects of the man they had once dismissed. Elias Vance supervised them from the bank of the newly reinforced creek. He didn't shout or micromanage. He pointed. He had no uniform, wearing the same pragmatic jeans and work shirt he always wore, but his presence was heavy, authoritative, and utterly non-negotiable. The creek, now a clean, stable channel, flowed obediently through a new, deeply set concrete spillway. The old dam was gone, replaced by a massive, tiered retaining wall of stone and concrete, built to withstand a 100-year flood event. This construction was funded by the community's insurance, secured by Elias, and built with his own 2 hands guiding the contractors. Thorne paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a raw hand. He looked at the scars of the flood, the houses on Willow Bend rebuilt on high pilings, the communal mailbox cluster replaced by an austere, functional steel unit, and felt a wave of crushing permanent defeat. He walked over to Elias, who was examining the mortar mix on the retaining wall. "Elias," Thorne said, his voice quiet, devoid of its former timbre. "We secured the last tranche of the insurance payout this morning." Chen confirmed it. "The community center foundation is stable, the floodplain homes are elevated, and the retention wall is complete." Elias nodded, not looking up from the mortar. "It's a 25-year wall, not a $32,000 wall?" "Right," Thorne conceded. "The work is done. The community is safe, and we have enough money left over to replenish the reserve. The legal counsel is asking for a transition plan. They want to set up an election, re-establish the board, and draft new covenants." Thorne hesitated. "When do you step down? When do we return to normal governance?" Elias finally looked up, his eyes the color of the granite stone he was setting. "Normalcy? You think that was normal, Thorne? Spending $50,000 on petunia maintenance while neglecting the core structure that held the land together? That was terminal narcissism masquerading as governance." He straightened up, brushing dust from his hands. "I told you the condition. I manage the community until it is structurally and financially rebuilt. We are structurally sound. Now for the financial structure." Elias turned and walked toward the small wooden shed near his property line, the one that housed the vital sluice gate. Thorne followed, recognizing the finality in the movement. Inside the shed, the massive, rusted crank wheel they had desperately fought 6 months earlier was now spotless, lubricated and painted a bright functional red. The sluice gate was lifted, revealing the wide stone-lined diversion channel leading away into the dense woods behind Elias's house. Elias stopped beside the open sluice. "When you sued me for $32,000, you were arguing over a fee for a wall I built on my own property. That wall was part of the diversion system, which you tried to fine into non-existence. When I saved the community, I used my property, my land, my quarry pit, to absorb the flood." He pointed at the channel. "I have registered a permanent, non-negotiable flood easement against the Whisper Creek Estates Association. It is tied to the land title of every single home, including mine. That diversion channel and the quarry pit are now permanent, required infrastructure." "What does that mean?" Thorne asked, a cold dread creeping into him. "It means the community can never, ever touch this structure. It means the HOA must maintain this sluice gate to my specifications in perpetuity. It means the core function of the association is now, legally and forever, flood control and infrastructure maintenance, not color palettes and landscaping." Elias stepped back, looking at Thorne with the quiet authority of a man who had won the game by changing the board and the governance. "When do you release control?" Thorne pressed. Elias reached into the pocket of his shirt and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. It was an addendum to the HOA's governing documents, already signed and legally notarized. "I have dissolved the 5-member board," Elias stated. "The new governing document creates a 3-person stewardship council. 2 members will be elected from the residents with the highest infrastructure management certifications. The 3rd member will be the permanent non-voting steward of the water, a position held by whoever owns this property." He tapped the ground. "Me," Thorne realized. "You," Elias confirmed. "Or the next owner. The steward's only job is to ensure the integrity of the dam and the sluice is never compromised by fees or vanity. The steward has veto power over any budget item that reduces funding for structural integrity below a set threshold." Elias handed the paper to Thorne. "I won't step down. I will simply transition. I am going from interim president to the permanent steward of the water. You lost your power over $32,000 and your arrogance. I have secured the community's safety for the next century, and the only fee I've instituted is that your governance will forever be subject to the man who saved you from yourselves." Thorne unfolded the document, reading the stark, elegant legal language that permanently cemented Elias Vance's influence over the community. It wasn't revenge. It was an institutionalization of consequence. Thorne looked up, not at a victim or a villain, but at a founder. "You built the dam, Elias, and now you've built the association." Elias offered a faint, tired smile. "I paid the price, Thorne. And now the association will pay the price, eternal vigilance." He turned and walked back toward his house, leaving Thorne alone by the perfectly maintained sluice gate. Thorne looked at the paper, then at the sturdy permanent construction of the new dam. His old life of power and status was a ghost. He was left with only the hard, unglamorous truth. The safety of their homes depended on the meticulous, unforgiving vigilance of the man they tried to destroy. The new constitution of Whisper Creek Estates was written not in legalese but in concrete and bitter experience.